Hi there. My name is Heather Krause, and welcome to Talking Data Equity for Friday, July 19th. I am so happy that you are here. We have lots of familiar friends, and I know for sure we have a couple of new folks with us today because we have a very exciting topic. Let me introduce you to the idea of Talking Data Equity. The company that I run is called We All Count, which is a project for equity in data. And probably the very favorite thing that my company does is this Talking Data Equity. And what this this is a gathering that happens most Fridays at this time, noon my time. I live in Toronto. And at this gathering, anybody from any sector, any discipline, any age, any country can join us and talk about like the practicalities and the nuts and bolts of trying to align the work that we're doing with data, the evidence that we're generating with data, and the values and the lived experiences that we are trying to prioritize. And we do that in lots and lots of different ways. Sometimes we talk about techniques, and sometimes I'll do a little tutorial. Last week, I did a little tutorial on including community voice in causal analysis. We're definitely going to do a part two. I hear you on that. And sometimes we have special guests, and that's what we're doing today. We have a fantastic special guest. And so I'm going to introduce the special guest in a moment, and then they're going to share their screen, share some really cool stories and examples that I know you're going to love. While our special guest is sharing their screen and their stories, we ask that you keep your microphone muted, turned off, and feel free to utilize the chat. You can ask questions, you can have conversations, you can make comments and have all of that in the chat. And then when our special guest is done sharing their slides, that's when we'll have a live question and answer portion where you can turn your microphone on and ask questions directly. Okay. We're all good. Oh, last thing I should say is that we are recording this. And the reason that we're recording this is that we share the recordings in our We All Count Data Equity Community Forum. And that's because lots of people cannot attend at this exact time on this exact day who could really benefit from the sharing and the questions and the knowledge. And so we put it over there in our community forum. So if you want to come back and watch it, we'll also post resources and slides there as well, in case you want to follow up. Okay, so with all of that, let me introduce you to our special guest, Amalie Zinn. And Amalie is a research analyst in the Housing Finance Policy Center at the Urban Institute. And her work focuses on the intersection of racial equity and housing finance. Specifically, she studies how historically underserved people and communities access and preserve credit, capital, home ownership, both within and across generations. She joined the Urban Institute where, after graduating from University of Wisconsin at Madison, where she got her degree in economics and French plus public policy minor. So I'm going to turn it over to Amalie. Thank you so much for making the time in your schedule to join us today. We really are looking forward to this.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Heather, for having me. I'm super thrilled to be here. I'm going to share my screen. Oh, I hit slide, not share screen. Um,
No worries. All good.
can you all see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Great. Um, so, like I
And
said,
perfect.
very grateful to be here and really excited to chat with all of you. My name is Amalie Zinn, like Heather said. And I just also wanted to say that this work that I'm going to share today on housing, wealth, and some projections about what the future of all of that is going to look like is not just my own work. It's a product of work that I've done with some of my really fantastic colleagues in the Housing Finance Policy Center at the Urban Institute. In particular, work with Michael Neal, Lena Zhu, and Jung Choi. I'm just super grateful and privileged to work with all of them and everyone at Urban. And even though it's their work as well, the views expressed in this presentation are my own. So I just wanted to preface everything with that. One final piece of housekeeping is that a lot of this analysis, where disaggregated by race, focuses only on Black and white households. And that was a specific choice because the work we were doing was on Black and white wealth. It was funded by the Black Wealth Data Center, which is a Bloomberg initiative. That's not to say that studying other racial and ethnic groups is not important or that it's not a part of my work. And I'd be happy to answer questions about other communities where I can. So I just wanted to note that up top. I also figured that it made sense to start with a little bit of table setting here, in particular because then you can all know where I was coming from when I started the analysis, what drove me and the rest of the research team to ask the questions that we did, and eventually the lens through which we were all viewing the analysis to make sure that we're all on the same page, and also so that hopefully you all can gut check maybe some of my biases that I was bringing into the work. The first thing is that, as you all probably well know, potentially from your own experiences, homeownership is a major contributor to household wealth. For many households, it is the biggest purchase they will make in their entire life. And this is true on the net as well. In 2022, this is the latest data we have. Primary residence wealth made up more than 1/4 of all assets held by all households. So it's the biggest single contributor to total wealth in the United States. To give a little bit of context, business interests, for example, another big contributor, make about 1/5 of all household assets. So homeownership is more here. And particularly when you look at individual levels and you cut by race, we find that for Black and Latino households, their housing wealth makes up a disproportionately high share of their total wealth. That is, they're less liquid when they're homeowners. They have fewer other parts of wealth that they have access to. We also well know, as I'm sure you all do, that access to homeownership is not and has not been equal. Historical policy and practice was explicitly discriminatory. I've listed out a few examples here, but not only did these practices bar many people of color from accessing homeownership in the first place, but even among those who were able to access homeownership, they were barred from the same wealth benefits of homeownership as white households had access to. And this was explicit in policy and practice. Additionally, while there were some gains made after the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968, which barred explicit racial discrimination in the housing market, these gains were actually erased during the Great Recession, which hit Black and Hispanic families the hardest. They lost a significant portion of their wealth because so many of them lost their homes and were foreclosed on. And I also think it's important to note that even though explicit racial discrimination is outlawed in the housing market and in credit and lending markets today, the borrower and the credit characteristics that underlie and drive lending decisions and outcomes, so whether or not one is approved for a loan and the terms of that loan, are only race neutral on the surface. That is, they really reflect one's access to formal financial systems, which we all know are not truly race neutral. And so who has access to building credit, to not being trapped in cycles of debt, to having fair outcomes in the labor market that allow them to earn a good income. All of these things have disparate outcomes by race, and so therefore there are disparate outcomes in the lending market, even when controlling for lots of characteristics. So it's both some discrimination as well as underlying discrimination in the factors that drive these decisions. The last point I'll mention is housekeeping, is just in terms of why we're doing this analysis now and why I think this is timely. We know that home price increases and a severe housing supply shortage, particularly since the Great Recession, has really pushed homeownership out of reach for many households. And we also know that the people that were able to achieve homeownership and sustain it for this period of time have benefited really significantly from the home equity gains, kind of driving a wedge between what I would call the haves and the have-nots of homeownership. And I'll come back to that throughout the presentation. So getting into some data, which I think this is a group that loves that. I do too. We all do at the Urban Institute. I want to start showing some charts. And so the first thing is that the Black-white homeownership rate gap has actually increased since 1970, just 2 years after the passage of the Fair Housing Act. And I mentioned some of the dips due to the Great Recession, so after 2010, but even here we can see that since 1970, the white homeownership rate has increased by about 7 percentage points. In 1970, it was at about 66%. In 2022, the latest data, 73% of white households are homeowners. The Black homeownership rate has actually also increased over this period, but to a significantly lesser degree, by fewer than 2.5 percentage points. And so we can see here a lot of times in this work, we're talking about equity. We're talking about closing the gap. And not only have we not seen a convergence in the gap, we haven't even seen equality. We haven't even seen the same gains in Black homeownership as we've seen in white homeownership over this period, where, there have been really significant increases in the protections, at least in theory, that people of color, Black people in particular, should be facing in the housing market. Notably, we also do see a pretty similar story with wealth. Over the same period, Black wealth has increased, but so has the Black-white wealth gap, again, spurred by the fact that white wealth has increased greater and faster. And this is driven by the fact that the wealth gap between homeowners and renters has grown really significantly in the past 3 decades. On the left-hand side here, you can see both the average wealth gap between homeowners and renters and the median wealth gap. We can see the average here is really high. It's nearly 1.4 million in 2022, the highest that it's ever been since the data were collected, starting in 1989. But the average is pretty wide, and that's because so much of a significant share of wealth is concentrated among a really small share of households. So we're seeing a lot of that, right tail of the distribution affecting the average. So I actually think it's more useful here to look at the blue line, which is the median wealth gap. So the typical wealth gap between renters and owners, and even that is the highest it's ever been. It's nearly $400,000 in 2022 in the wealth of a typical homeowner versus the wealth of a typical renter. Over this period since 1989, the typical homeowner increased their wealth by about $165,000, the typical renter by fewer than $6,000. So clearly we're seeing that who is and has become a homeowner, they are earning a ton more wealth over the decades, but we know that access to home ownership is not equal. And we know that a lot of the disparities in wealth have been driven by housing wealth. Specifically, this shows the gap between renters and owners in different types of wealth, housing wealth, financial wealth, and other wealth. We can see here that particularly since the Great Recession, when we've seen that really acute supply side shortage, we've seen a really steep increase in the median gap in housing wealth between owners and renters. So the people that have become and sustained home ownership have been able to benefit really from the massive home equity gains that are driven by a high home price, low supply, competitive environment. At the same time, because home prices and affordable supply are decreasing, rents have increased, and they've actually increased much faster than incomes. And all of this means that the typical renter has limited savings left over. The typical renter today is actually cost burdened, spending more than 30% of their income on their rent each month. And so they have very limited savings left over after paying for housing. And so really renters we've seen haven't been able to benefit from the strong financial market to the same degree as homeowners. We can see here that even the yellow line, we've seen an increase in the median financial wealth gap, particularly since 2019 when rents have gone up really significantly and incomes have not gone up to the same degree, as well as we've seen issues with inflation. So the typical goods just cost more, but incomes have not been adjusted to the same degree. We're also nearing a really potential massive increase in overall and racial wealth disparities. And I think that this is a cause for concern, not just for those of us that might have moral qualms or kind of normative qualms about inequities in housing and wealth and financial markets, but also because there's a lot of research that suggests that inequality is really bad for everyone. It has a negative drag on economic growth and efficiency. It can reduce innovation. If we don't reduce inequities and inequalities, we are likely to all be worse off. So why are we nearing this potential massive wealth transfer? The number one reason is that wealth begets wealth. And that's this idea that a high level of wealth enables one greater access to wealth building activities. That is, access to more favorable credit, the ability to purchase an appreciating asset like a home. It also provides one the ability to take risks, to cover financial losses, and to withstand periods of hardship like a job loss or an income loss. In other words, I like to think of wealth as kind of both a safety net and as a springboard, something that can keep you from falling down to a lower echelon of wealth and something that can propel you upwards into that next echelon of wealth and mobility. And we're seeing this playing out really directly in the housing market. Research from my colleagues at the Urban Institute has found that parental homeownership and wealth are both really big contributors to homeownership rates among millennials, even when controlling for a number of factors. And survey data recently has found that a really increasing share of young home buyers are planning to use a cash gift from family or friends to cover their down payments. And I think it's worth thinking about this because if support from parents is a really key way to accessing homeownership in this period where we're lacking affordable housing supply, then we can only imagine that the racial homeownership and wealth gaps are going to grow in this next generation. That's because the way that wealth is passed across generations essentially preserves the wealth generation in the wealth distribution, in one generation to the next. And so there's a racial slant in who can financially support their family and friends, driven in part by who is able to access homeownership and the wealth that it provides in previous generations. And right now we're nearing a market where potentially that family wealth is one of the few ways to access potentially the biggest, most accessible, historically, wealth building activity that we have. So I want to get into some data on this. We know that baby boomers are nearing retirement. We also know that they hold a very, very high share, more than half of total wealth in the United States, disproportionate to their population share. We also know that they don't hold this wealth evenly. This is the total assets owned by senior families, defined as those aged 58 or older by race. And here we can see that white households own nearly $88 trillion in wealth, compared to Black households who own fewer than $2 trillion in wealth. Just a massive disparity. You can barely see the lines on the right side. We can also see that housing wealth makes up a disproportionately high share of Black wealth relative to white total wealth. Nearly half of Black total wealth. We're not even close to that on white wealth. So there's just more liquidity among white seniors. They have different assets that they can transfer. Not everything is tied up in housing, which one might have to liquidate in a different way than one might have to liquidate their other assets. And we're seeing this starting to play out. We're seeing that younger white homeowners and renters are more likely than Black homeowners and renters actually to expect to receive an inheritance. Here we've got the share of younger families that say that they expect to receive a sizable inheritance by race. Overall, about 23% of white households say they expect to receive an inheritance. These are households that are younger than 58, compared to about 10% of Black households. Meanwhile, white homeowners, nearly a quarter of them, about 24%, say that they expect to receive an inheritance, compared to just about 13% of Black homeowners. So we're seeing a disparity across race. That being said, we're also seeing that both white homeowners and Black homeowners are more likely than their renting counterparts by race to expect to receive an inheritance. So we're seeing both tenure and racial disparities playing out. And it's not just whether one receives an inheritance or not, it's actually about how much one receives to determine how useful that will be. We're seeing that white households are expecting to receive significantly more than their Black counterparts, really, again, across tenure. The typical white homeowner says that they expect to receive about $280,000 in inheritance. The typical Black renter, fewer than $50,000. And we actually see this same pattern in distribution in terms of white homeowner, white renter, Black homeowner, Black renter. Among those who have already received an inheritance, though I'll note the amounts are lower, and that's because a lot of the households that have already received a transfer of wealth might still be expecting to gain more. They could have received an in vivos transfer, but be expecting to receive an inheritance in the next few decades. So again, I'll come back to this idea that wealth begets wealth, and show that we can already see this rippling into homeownership. People that have received inheritances are disproportionately likely to be homeowners among both white and Black households. We can see here that about 22% of 22% of white homeowners have received inheritances compared to about 14% of white renters. About 10% of Black homeowners have received inheritances compared to about 4% of Black renters. And overall, we see a racial disparity again in who has received an inheritance. So I'll come back to what I said at the beginning, which is that the gap between the haves and the have-nots of homeownership is growing, and this is true among young people too. Just in the past decade, we've seen the wealth gap between young renters and young homeowners increase. And in large part, that's because it's been driven by an increase in the housing wealth gap between these people. The people that have been able to access homeownership since 2010 are significantly better off than those who haven't been able to access it. And the people that have been able to access homeownership since 2010 are disproportionately white people with significant family wealth. Again, increasing racial disparities across generations as opposed to closing them. And so what I would say here is that the status quo, what we have today, really won't cut it. This is a little bit of math, and I'd be happy to share the paper if you want to read more about the assumptions that we made. It's pretty crude, but the basics here is that we took a look at not just who expects to receive an inheritance, but the expected amount. And we calculated kind of what we said would be the minimum amount needed for a down payment on an FHA mortgage. That's 3.5% of one's median home value. We just looked at the median home value for younger Black families, families younger than 58. And we looked at the number of renters, Black and white, that expect to receive that amount in inheritance. And we found that if they receive that amount, and if all the people that receive that amount become homeowners because they weren't before, we will see an increase in Black homeownership of about 3.4%. But we will see a greater increase in white homeownership. at about nearly 8%, almost the exact same difference that I showed in the first graph that I showed here, which is just a really good example of how the status quo, letting wealth transfer in the same way from one generation to the next, is not going to cut it if we really want to reduce inequities and frankly, inequalities. Again, 3.4% increase versus 7.7% increase. Again, I want to note this is a pretty rough estimate. It's not a projection. We are making a bunch of assumptions, which you can read about in the paper, which I'll be happy to link. That being said, a lot of my current work is doing similar work to this, but using much more rigorous models. So I feel really confident about the direction that this suggests. So I would just say that even though we're making some assumptions, I do think that this math is still pretty good. So I think this all begs the question, is increasing access and equity and access to homeownership the answer to reducing these disparities? And I would argue that it's kind of a yes and. In other words, that it's not so simple. And I want to investigate some of the nuances in this from another paper that I wrote with my colleagues. One of the reasons why I don't think it's so simple is because homeownership is not created equal. Being a homeowner does not guarantee you access to the best home for everyone. That being said, overall, few homeowners do live in homes that are deemed inadequate. These are homes that have severe issues with heating and cooling systems, with vermin problems, with significant leaks, homes that really are not safe and comfortable for someone to live in. On the net, renters are much more likely than homeowners to live in these homes, which is a massive problem. We need better code enforcement for renters. We need to make sure that renters have access to safe homes and that everyone has access to safe and comfortable homes. That being said, even among homeowners, we found that Black homeowners are twice as likely as white homeowners to live in inadequate homes. Black homeowners represent about 9% of all homeowners, but they actually account for more than 15% of homeowners that live in inadequate homes. So they are disproportionately likely to live in these homes. And this doesn't just have implications in terms of one's health, how safe and how comfortable one is in their own living space, but it actually has financial implications too. Inadequate homes in general, regardless of the race of the owner, have lower property values than adequate ones. That's what the blue bar shows here. We're seeing those overall differences by adequacy. We also know that racial gaps in home value are real, and we found that they persist across homes in different conditions. That is, Black homeowners living in inadequate homes have significantly lower home values than their white counterparts. So not only are Black homeowners more likely to live in inadequate homes, they're also more likely to live in lower valued ones, and those two issues compound upon each other. Someone might say, okay, but aren't these homes probably a lot more affordable? Aren't they easier for people to access? To that, I would say yes. Once you control for square footage, we can see here that inadequate homes tend to be smaller on average for both Black and white homeowners. The property value per square foot is lower. So we can see here, inadequate, adequate across race, property values are lower in inadequate homes. So maybe they're more accessible for the home buyer with fewer assets. Maybe they can get in there and renovate it. I'll talk a little bit about that shortly. And so if these homes are more affordable, they should be less costly over time. One's total housing cost should hopefully be lower. On the whole, we see that's true. And that's particularly true for Black homeowners who live in the lowest value and in the smallest homes. Their total housing costs on a annually are lower than that of white homeowners living in inadequate homes and of all those living in adequate homes. That includes things like their monthly mortgage payment, their property tax burden, their insurance costs. All of those things tend to be lower for people living in inadequate homes. Where we see a little difference in this trend is when it comes to utility costs. And that is in particular, Black homeowners living in inadequate homes face the highest median annual utility costs once you adjust for square footage. And so that begs the question of what's going on here. And we think that largely this might be driven by the age of these homes. That is that generally inadequate homes are significantly older. A much lower share of inadequate homes were built since 2000. A much higher share were built before 1960. That probably means they're less likely to be insulated. They probably have older appliances. All of these things suck up energy and increase one's utility cost. Doesn't fully explain the disparity by race, so we'll have to get into that a little bit. But just looking at construction year, we can see some differences and that the utility costs, more so than things like one's mortgage payment or total housing costs, reflecting the age of the home. We also know that it's not just that one faces a higher utility cost. They actually face a greater utility cost burden. That is the share of their income that they have to spend on their utility cost. We can see here that Black homeowners living in inadequate homes, that's this middle top one here, 6.6% of their income on average has to be spent on utility costs. That's a really high burden. One is considered to be energy cost burdened, which is a lot of utilities, if they spend more than 6% of their income on utilities. Here, the average Black homeowner living in an inadequate home is cost burdened in that sense by their utility bill. And this is driven in part by racial disparities in median household incomes. We can see here that across adequacy, there are some differences, some pretty significant differences in income, but also across race. And so we're seeing those compound upon each other. And I'd like to highlight that the utility cost burden really goes beyond the financial implications of it. Certainly, it's a drag on one's spending and what else they can access. But also, we found that Black homeowners living in inadequate homes were really likely to have received a utility shutoff notice in the past year. A quarter of all Black homeowners living in inadequate homes received a utility shutoff notice. That has really severe implications because a lot of utility shutoff notices turn into disconnection notices, or they turn into one reducing some basic necessities to make sure that their energy doesn't get shut off. And so we can see here, this is just by race. This is from the Residential Energy Consumption Survey, which the latest data is from 2020. It doesn't have the adequacy of home, but we did look by tenure. So we looked at just Black homeowners versus white homeowners. We can see that a really significant share of Black homeowners on the net received disconnection notices relative to their white counterparts. Nearly a third said that they reduced or forwent basic necessities to cover their home energy bill. And 17% of Black homeowners said that they kept their home at an unhealthy temperature in the past year because of their utility costs and their energy bill. This has really serious implications. I don't know where you all are, but I'm based in DC and it's been over 100 degrees this week. And if folks are not able to air condition their homes and cool them, that has really serious implications for their health, for their well-being, for their life expectancy. Forgoing basic necessities like food and healthcare has really serious implications. We discussed this a bit more in the paper. We're not health researchers. We referred to a lot of the work done by colleagues at the Health Policy Center at Urban. But I will just say that this is really serious. And I've been hearing a lot of stories from practitioners in the field about the people that they work with who have not been able to access renovation financing, who are living in these homes that are just completely unsafe. And they've got really serious issues, pulmonary issues, air quality issues that are affecting their lungs. These are really serious issues that go beyond what's in one's pocket or what's in one's portfolio that we all should care about. I'll move a bit into financing because I do think that's one of the reasons we saw some of those racial disparities and not just the adequacy disparities. One thing is that generally it's really hard to access home improvement financing, but we found that Black homeowners are a bit more likely to use a credit card or other financing to fund their home improvements relative to their white counterparts, who are a bit more likely to use cash from savings or a home equity loan or cash from refinancing, which makes sense given that Black homeowners are less likely to have access to home improvement financing. And we know that their portfolios in general tend to be smaller too, so they're less likely to have access to savings, they're less liquid. We can see here the denial rates for two different types of home improvement loans, cash out refinances and the typical home improvement loan, which is pretty hard to access. And we can see that for Black homeowners, they're just having significantly higher denial rates than their white counterparts. Again, I'll echo that these denial rates are in part because of credit characteristics. So a lot of lenders might say, hey, well, this is because the credit scores of the typical Black homeowner are lower, or they have fewer liquid assets because so much more of their wealth is tied up in their housing. Again, this is all true. And I just think it's important to bring back the fact that those measures of one's financial capability, of one's ability to repay their loan, are really only facially race neutral. And once you dig a little bit under the surface, you can see historical discrimination and present day discrimination in the labor market, in access to credit, previously playing out in all of that. But we do know that the typical Black homeowner has far fewer financial assets than the typical white one. They're also more likely to hold credit card debt than their white counterparts. Again, this all has to do with the fact that the homes that they get are valued lower, contributing to fewer financial assets. They're more likely to be trapped in cycles of debt because they have less access to safe capital. Again, it all repeats upon itself. Also, I would just say that overall, very few rehabilitation loans are made through FHA's program, which tends to be more accessible for people with fewer resources, and that's really a big reason for its design. You can see that even in 2015, only about 12,000 total loans were made through this program. That's the blue line. just a super small number relative to the total number of homeowners that might want to improve or repair their home. And a lot of these loans are actually made for homes that need the purchase of homes that need repair, as opposed for refinancing for existing homeowners and then repairing. So for all existing homeowners, regardless of race, it can be really difficult just to get financing for repairs. And this is where I would say the role for public policy is particularly large. I won't read through all of this, and I'll definitely share the slides after if folks want to dig in. But I do think there are some real opportunities for both federal and state and local policymakers. Even small things like streamlining programs by removing barriers like income verification, credit score requirements, forbearance status, needing a new appraisal, needing a different title insurance. All these things are barriers that make it harder for people with the fewest resources and time to access the programs that do exist. And there's a lot of work, including from one of my colleagues, Lori Goodman at the Urban Institute, that just shows that these barriers don't actually make the program or the borrowers that access it less risky in any meaningful way. And so changing and streamlining those programs can be really helpful. There's also opportunities to make sure that everybody has more access to refinancing, regardless of how much they're able to pay attention to declining interest rates on the daily or changes in that. Some of those fluctuations move really quickly, and not everyone's able to realize that. So things like requiring servicers to establish contact with borrowers, those are really good options. Also opportunities to improve the FHA 203K program. There was actually some recent good news on that, which I'll discuss in a moment, so I'll come back to that. And then definitely at the state and local level, a lot of these issues happen really locally, right? They're at a household level. If a singular home is in need of repair, sometimes there are programs at state and local levels that are often targeted for people with lower income, either grant or low interest loan programs, particularly for repairs that are repair needs that are affecting residents' health and safety, which I think are a lot of the needs that we highlighted based on home adequacy. And so better targeting these programs can be a good way for state and local leaders to use the capital that they have. A lot of these programs are pretty underfunded. Got some ideas for increasing funding there. But targeting the programs can help it reach people that are most in need, as well as, again, simple things that really don't require as much funding, simplifying, streamlining information, application processes, et cetera. Also, once we published this work, we heard from a lot of nonprofit leaders across different cities that they hadn't really seen this data, but it really reflected the experience of a lot of people they worked with. And that they found that there were some really significant holes in the public assistance programs in their community, and they were working to fill those holes. I think what's a really great idea for state and local governments is to work really closely with the nonprofits that are already on the ground and doing the work day in and day out, and the people that are seeing the problems with their programs every day, to make sure that every gap is stopped up, particularly when it comes to repair needs that affect residents' health and safety. I think every policymaker on the whole wants the people they serve to be healthy, hopefully to be comfortable. And so there are nonprofits already on the ground doing this work. So making it easier to access renovation and rehabilitation financing is, for me, a pretty good first step. Like I said, there was some recent good news, and I think it's always good to highlight that in housing. Just last week, the FHA announced some updates to its 203K program. And they increased the limited program, which is a lot easier to access for people with lower incomes. They increased the loan amount maximum. They also said they'll update that loan amount maximum annually, which has never happened before. They extended the rehabilitation timelines for the program, and they allowed some of the funds from the limited program to now cover consultant fees. So people that need help covering the consultant fees on their project, they can now use loan dollars for that. That's all really good news. There are still some, I think, changes that need to be made, but these are really good first steps, and shows that there is a tension around this right now among housing policymakers. That being said, I would really argue strongly that we still have a lot of work to do. As I've shown kind of throughout this presentation, homeownership really doesn't have the same benefits for Black households as it does for whites. This is not the only work that suggests that. There's some great work from my colleagues at the Urban Institute showing that Black households in general are paying higher property tax burdens. They pay higher interest rates, so they earn less from homeownership and benefit less financially. And none of this is an accident. The way that our housing finance system was designed was not in regards to people of color and with their needs and what the issues that they face and what they want in the housing market. So I'd argue both that we need more equitable access to homeownership. A lot of that can be done through policy. We also need more equitable ways to access wealth. If you remember that first graph, the second graph that I showed that showed differences in wealth across renters and owners, we could see that renters really weren't benefiting from the financial market. And that's because right now, homeownership is one of the few real ways to access wealth in this country. And because there's not equity in access to homeownership, because there aren't enough homes for sale, we need to find other ways for people to access significant wealth and improve their life outcomes. I'd also argue that this is quite urgent. Population demographics are shifting really drastically. My colleagues have projected that in the next 2 decades, all of net household growth is going to come from households of color. 70% of net new homeowners over this time are projected to be Latino. We're really seeing a shift in who makes up the majority of our population, and we're going to continue to see that shift over time. I think it begs the question if we're ready and if our systems are ready to help all people build wealth, have opportunity, and achieve prosperity, particularly as all people changes in terms of what all people look like in this country. Currently, I'm doing some work interviewing other young housing experts at the Urban Institute about what they're seeing in the housing market, the biggest problems that they're facing, the policy changes that they think are exciting. And it's been really exciting to talk to so many people that have so many ideas. A lot of them just seem to realize how much housing affects other parts of one's life, like access to healthcare, access to healthy food, access to transportation, to community, resilience in terms of climate change. And so I think that right now policymakers do have a real opportunity to alleviate the challenges that a lot of young people are facing and really aware of right now. There's some recent polling that finds that housing is a top issue for young voters, and young voters right now make up nearly half of the electorate. So anyone running for office should really take all of this into account. I put some ideas here for some of the tools that policymakers and some of the changes that policymakers could make really today. That includes like changes to underwriting to increase access to credit. It also includes things like first generation down payment assistance, mortgage rate buy downs, even things like tax-free savings accounts for down payments like 529s, which we offer for education. These are all like really clear ideas that have been well researched by me and my colleagues and many others at the Urban Institute and elsewhere. We know that these policies could work, and policymakers have the tools. It's time to pull the lever on some of these. At the same time, we can't just do demand side policy. Talking to young people, but also just looking at the data, everyone is realizing that we've just got a huge supply crisis, particularly when it comes to the affordable end of the market. And so taking steps to increase housing supply overall, but certainly affordable housing supply that maybe wouldn't be built without a subsidy or without a tax credit, those are really important steps. Also, people are really concerned about climate change. And so tying improvements to housing to improvements in climate resiliency and addressing climate change, these are really important. There was recent work that found that Latino people are disproportionately likely to be affected by flooding. And so thinking about what housing adequacy means for different people, who's more likely to have an inadequate home in the next few years because of things like hurricanes, flooding, wind damage, who's more likely to face higher utility cost burdens because of things like heat. All of those things really matter. And so addressing climate change for me is kind of like a double whammy in terms of what young people care about when it comes to policy. They care about housing, they care about climate change, and really we all should. I'll kind of end with this, which is a lot of how I think about housing. Housing is a very tangible and tractable part of wealth, and it represents a lot to many people and families. A lot of people want to be homeowners. A lot of people remember the house they grew up in, houses or apartments that belong to their family and friends that they have good memories in. For me, that's like really why I wanted to study housing as part of wealth. I'm very interested in wealth equity, but I feel like housing is a way to connect to so many people when it comes to wealth equity, which can feel really large and kind of intractable. When you get to housing, everyone's got an opinion, everyone's got a story. And policymakers do, I think, really have the tools today to make changes that can help a lot more people access this big path to wealth and this emotional burden of homeownership, something that a lot of people want to take on. I think policymakers have those tools. That said, more still needs to be done. We saw throughout these slides that the status quo isn't going to cut it, that there's a massive potential for increases in inequities in the next few decades. More needs to be done by policymakers. When I talked to young researchers, a lot of them said policymakers need to be more innovative. They need to be less held to those in power, like homeowners and people with a lot of financial wealth that maybe have the ear of policymakers more than others. They need to spend more. I also think, like for myself, more needs to be done by researchers to think outside of the box and not just evaluate what's on the ground, but to think of innovative solutions, but also by all of us. When it comes to things like inadequate housing, Like I said, there are these nonprofits that are in many of our communities. There are ways to step up and help our neighbors. There are ways for us to fill in the gaps that are happening right now. And while I wouldn't say that's the best path towards systemic change, I think we kind of all owe that to our communities, and would really encourage people to hopefully take this to heart. That's a personal plea, not a plea of the Urban Institute. Um, thank you very much. I hope that you will all stay connected to our work. You can feel free to email me or follow me on LinkedIn or on Twitter. I post all my work pretty regularly, as do my colleagues. And if you're interested in young people in housing, the blog that I mentioned, or the work that I mentioned, is part of a series that my colleague and I are working on. We'll be releasing several blogs in August about what we found in our interviews with young experts. So definitely those will be up in Housing Matters, which is one of the blog sites of the Urban Institute. Definitely feel free to subscribe to their newsletter and check that out. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Amalie. We're so excited to have you join us, and all that excitement paid off. That was so useful, and I want to thank you again for making time, and also thank you for sharing the slides and the resources. I'm already getting lots of requests being DM'd to me for the slides and the resources, so I know they'll be in high demand. And I'll just say to all of you, for sure, at the link in the chat, we're going to have the recording, we're going to have the slides, we're going to have resources, and you can keep asking questions in the forum after today is over. And as promised, this is the time where you can either ask a question in the chat. If you feel shy about asking a question in the chat, you can direct message me a question in the chat. My name is Heather Kraus. I'm happy to ask your question on your behalf. If you don't feel comfortable asking it, that's no problem. And if you're here in the room and you want to turn your video and your microphone on, or just your microphone on, and ask a question, now is the time for you to do that. Because we have a couple hundred people, the best thing to do is raise your hand using the little Zoom raise your hand function, which usually is in the React thing. It's sometimes shaped like a heart. It's sometimes shaped like a little person with a plus on their head. If you can't figure out how to raise your hand, you can just turn your microphone on, and that's fine. I will start with a technical question that a number of people asked in the chat. Can you help us understand how adequate housing is defined?
Yes, that is such a good question. I can definitely send the link to how HUD defines adequacy. I will say, very bare bones, it's a super, super low burden. The vast majority of homes are considered adequate. So it's not about the size of the home or whether or not it meets an individual family's needs. It's about an outside assessment that has to do with things like if there's a lot of vermin in one's home, if they have lead paint, for example, if their heating system doesn't work, if their cooling system doesn't work. It's not even like it's not enough. It's just if it really doesn't work. So it actually doesn't even have to do with like, if you live in a hot environment and you've only got a window unit, that's not considered inadequate, even though it might really be that on the ground. So it's a very, very low, very, very like high threshold to be considered inadequate. So I would really say this is like kind of a lower bound on the number of people that are experiencing repair needs that affect their health and safety or just improvement needs. But I can definitely share the link to the actual text that HUD has. And we've got more in the paper that explores what adequacy means.
Yeah. And I think it's important to note that it's although it sounds like a really subjective term, and it is a very subjective term in the data that's being collected, like the federal government makes a definition for adequate and then they decide. So it's not you as an individual in this research making that subjective decision. And that's important to, it's like an official federal designation. And there is lots of research about how it doesn't really measure anything meaningful in terms of like the race and all of that, but it's the best data you have, so you have to use it.
Yeah, I would also say like generally the data on property condition is really poor. Even at Urban, we have access to like private aggregated property data. And most of the data, so this is like assessment data, says like home is in fine condition. There's like a 1 to 5 threshold. Most of it is 3. So it's really not helpful. I look forward to seeing, there is now like really good data that private groups have, like insurers, because they have to decide what homes to insure. So they know things like roof condition and materials. and they take pictures almost every day using flyovers. So I hope that, federally, that policymakers can find ways to access that data so that we all have a better picture of it.
What a good point is that there is like insurance and proprietary data. Yeah. Angela, thank you for waiting. Go ahead and turn your microphone on.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for this fabulous presentation. I'm a Black homeowner, and the only reason I'm a homeowner is because my father owned the home, and I rented for a long time before I was able to buy the house. The question I would have for you, though, is that as you mentioned, the home is not liquid. So the real question is how do you leverage that wealth that you on paper have to the benefit of your children without leveraging the home or without selling it, right? Because it doesn't have any cash value until you either sell it or you can actually pull the equity out. I'm kind of in that situation now. I have a lot of equity. I lived through the crack wars and the drug gangs and all that stuff. And now I have gentrification. I could sell my home and go maybe and get that and realize that profit. But where would I go?
That's such a good question. I'm sorry to hear that you're facing that. It's definitely a challenge, and I'm actually doing a lot of work right now on the intergenerational transfers of the literal home asset. So how that transfers in terms of wills, like if you were to pass your actual home, your house to your children, like it sounds like maybe your dad did to you. I think there are some ways to like extract some equity from your home and not all of it if you need liquid assets. Some of that comes through like a home equity line of credit. Some of that comes if you're 65 years of age or older, you can access the home equity conversion mortgage program, which is a lower cost generally way to extract home equity, and you don't have to repay it. Your kids would have to repay it either themselves or off the sale of the home. So they would get a decreased amount of wealth theoretically if they sold the home, but they could still get some depending on how much you extracted. That being said, there's actually some like pretty significant upfront cost burdens to access that home equity, which is why a lot of people end up selling their home if it's their major asset. And so I'm doing work on that. We're trying to find solutions. But there are systems in place. So things like the HECM program, it can be hard to access. One thing that's great is that there are free home equity conversion mortgage counselors that you could talk to when you're debating if you wanted to get a home equity conversion mortgage. So those folks who are really experts in that specific product could help you consider if like this product is right for you, or if you should cash out refinance, or if you're still paying your mortgage, rate refinance to be more liquid, things like that. So those are really like those housing counselors are really the experts in that program. But I'll be happy to share the work that I've done on that program and on home equity lines of credit as well. We know that it's really hard for people to access the liquidity from their homes, particularly people where like a significant portion is tied up in that. And that's a really big issue. So I'm hoping for more like grant programs too, so people can maybe access the upfront costs. And so like buffer the upfront costs and then access the wealth in their homes. They could pay it back or in low interest form, or it could be a grant.
Well, thank you for that. And but white folks are able to do it before these programs are available. And I wasn't sure, how did they do that?
I mean, I think part of it is that on average, in general, the white homeowner has less of their total wealth tied up in their home. Again, that's driven by the fact that they're more likely to have received like really significant inheritances. They're more likely to earn more and have been able to invest in the financial market. They're more likely to have been homeowners for longer, so they've paid off their mortgage, they're free and clear, they invest more in the market. And all of that's like driven really by structural racism and by discrimination and what assets people are able to access. So I do think that like there are significant racial disparities driven by discrimination. Definitely 100%.
Really important question. Thank you for raising it, because you make a really good point that even the very thoughtful and well-adjusted numbers still hide the actual impact of ongoing structural racism, because a dollar of wealth is not a dollar of wealth for everybody. And great answer, really great answer, Amalie. And it kind of leads into another question that's been posed by a few people in the chat, which is you've said a couple of times, and there's a lot of appreciation for that. You started out with talking about how, I'm just trying to look at the exact questions, that none of the numbers that you're about to show us are actually race neutral, even though they're adjusted for lots of things, like the whole funnel leading into wealth, credit, access to tons and tons of services and goods, mentorship, advisement, stuff like that, are all like the whole funnel is racist, even before you get to the slice of it that you're studying and dealing with. And there's a really common question, which is, depending on who you talk to, how much or how do you decide when to cite the evidence of the upstream racism that is impacting the numbers that you're showing and studying? Or can you just rely on the obvious history of racism and discrimination?
That's such a good question.
I thought so too. It's a great question.
That's something I really grapple with a lot in my work. Like basically all of my work focuses on racial equity. And sometimes I feel like I'm writing the same paragraph over and over. And I'm like, why don't we all just know this by now? Like this history is out there. It's so obvious. I'm really lucky at Urban. We've got like a massive comms team. So all my work gets reviewed. And they're really explicit about like, we need to cite. So like if we say something about historical discrimination, they always want us to cite it. Just to kind of make sure we've checked that box so that there really isn't any doubt by any reader, whether it's a policymaker, a practitioner, like the media, anyone. So that's kind of what I follow, is I try to give like a few examples and then cite to something that's larger. I'll also say that like I think there are some great resources at Urban and elsewhere that have compiled a lot of this information in one place. And so if you're like tight on word space or like space in something you're writing or sharing, even just one line and then like linking to that or citing that can be really great. Some of my colleagues wrote like a really digestible, readable blog about exactly what I talked about, the credit characteristics that underlie mortgage writing, that are steeped in structural racism. And I link to that in like almost every piece I do, because it's just so succinct, it's so well done, and it just lays it out. And then they link to so many more resources. I do think, unfortunately, like for better or for worse, we really need to cite evidence because right now, especially, I do think that there's like a lot of doubt about where discrimination comes from and why. There's also a lot of attacks, I think, on the like sharing of this history and the telling it, be it like in schools or in the media. And so I think it's like really important that as researchers and that as people that are referencing data, that we cite our sources. I always feel like that makes me more credible, I hope. And that like the rest of my findings are therefore more credible because people know that I kind of did my baseline homework. So I think it's kind of sad that we have to like cite something that is such an obvious fact to so many of us and an obvious reality for many of us. But for better or for worse, I do try to cite things every time I mention it.
Yeah, that's really helpful to know. And I think it's something that a lot of us here also grapple with. So it's always nice to hear how other people are navigating that situation. There are still lots more questions, but we need to wrap it up there because we really do try and keep it to an hour with even a couple of minutes before the hour so everybody can have a little self-care before their next call. We absolutely will be posting this recording as well as the slides as well as other resources. I know there are still some technical questions. You're going to be able to find all the answers to those technical questions about how things were measured, what were different gaps adjusted for and stuff like that. That's all in the documentation. And in that community forum, you can ask questions. It's not a membership site. You don't have to pay money or anything. So if we didn't get to your question today and you still have a question, put it in the chat under the video from today and we will 100% get back to you. So, Amalie, thank you so much. Told a fantastic, compelling story with really solid data. I appreciate so much. And you can see in the chat, there's tons and tons of appreciation for you. First of all, doing the work that you do and combining such important social topics with the research that you care about. And secondly, thank you for making time in that busy schedule to come and hang out with us and share. It meant a lot. It's going to have a lot of ripple impacts as people share your work as well. And for all of you who came and asked questions and listened and work every day to try and increase the equity in your data projects, it means the world to us that you are out there. You're definitely not alone. I know it's super turbulent right now. Thanks for spending an hour with us. We are actually not going to be here next Friday. I'm going to be somewhere with really bad Wi-Fi, and we tried that last July, and it was very frustrating for everybody. So we're going to be back in 2 weeks with an expert on accessibility and data visualization. I know that's a topic lots of you asked for, and it looks to be really cool. So thank you for caring. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Amalie, thank you so much.
Thank you, Heather, and thanks everyone for coming. This was so much fun for me. So I'm excited to be in touch with all of you.
Yeah, stay in touch. Okay. See ya. Bye, everybody.